Magic the Gathering's player base, like all gaming communities, has invented and adopted terms for certain effects, game actions, or color combinations. In this video, we'll go over a bunch of them and explain what they mean and where the names come from. The first thing we should talk about is the stack. The stack is how the game decides what cards resolve when. If one player wants to cast Lightning Bolt, but another player wants to cast Giant Growth, how do we decide which happens first? The basic gist is, as players cast spells, those spells get stacked on top of each other. Then, whenever everyone is done casting, we start resolving the stack. First, we resolve the spell on the very top of the stack, meaning the last spell someone cast is actually the first to resolve. Then, after one spell resolves, players actually get a chance to cast spells or activate abilities again, called getting priority. This means you can actually let a stack resolve part way and then build it up again, but only if you want to. Then, one by one, we take spells off the top of the stack, resolving each one, and if any abilities trigger, or if someone wants to cast more spells, we build it back up. You just keep doing this until the entire stack is empty, and then the game continues on from there. The stack is really important to understand because knowing when things resolve can help a ton. Going back to Bolt and Giant Growth, the order that these cards resolve can be really important. If you go to cast Bolt on your opponent's creatures, they can respond by casting Giant Growth on it. Since their growth will resolve first, the bear will be a 5/5 before it takes the damage, letting it survive. However, if they go to growth their creature first, you can respond by bolting it in response. Since the game will check to see if a creature should die in between spells resolving, this will kill the bear before it gets its power boosted. Basically, the stack resolves first in, last out, and remember that is really important for a bunch of interactions. One term you might hear is holding priority. This one's a bit complicated because it requires knowing how priority works in Magic. Basically, in Magic, players are constantly silently passing priority, because asking for priority every time you want to do something takes too long. How priority actually works is that anytime a spell or ability resolves, or a spell or ability is put onto the stack, or a player begins a step where players get priority, each player gets a chance to act in a specific order. First, the players whose turn it is gets a chance to do things, and if they don't want to do anything, each other player, going in turn order for multiple player games, gets to act. Technically speaking, spells resolve once every player chooses not to act after getting priority. The thing is, when players cast spells during their own turn, it's usually assumed by most players that they aren't going to use their priority to cast another spell, because most of the time they don't. However, if you want to do something like cast a fork targeting your divination, you need to hold priority, as you don't get a chance to do anything after your opponent chooses not to respond. The spell simply resolves at that point. If you want to fork it, you have to hold priority. This technically isn't anything special within the game's rules, but since players are always taking shortcuts to make Magic playable, it's something that players have to do to properly communicate what they're doing to their opponent. There's also a term called strictly better, everyone's favorite thing to, actually other people about. Strictly better refers to any card that has higher positive numbers, a lower cost, or more abilities without sacrificing any of these versus another card. An easy example is Lightning Bolt and Shock. Lightning Bolt is a strictly better shock because it costs the same amount of mana, is also instant speed, and deals more damage. However, Bolt isn't strictly better than Wind Slash because while it deals more damage, it doesn't have the other ability to stop damage prevention. Bolt is a better card, but it isn't strictly better. Now, some people would define strictly better as a card that's always better than another card, but that's not really true. There's always a situation where a card could theoretically be better if you're willing to stretch enough. Bolt deals more damage to you than Shock if you target yourself with it because your opponent mind-slavered you, but that's not really a situation we care about when evaluating cards. Getting away from the more technical stuff, let's talk about the term spot removal. Spot removal is a term for any card that gets rid of one or more cards on the field, but not all of them. Fatal Push is a spot removal spell because it destroys one creature. Naturalize is also spot removal because it destroys one artifact or enchantment on the field. Cards that can remove 2 cards in the field, like Return to Dust, are still spot removal because they remove a limited number of cards on the spot. But board wipes like Wrath of God aren't because they could remove an unlimited number of creatures. One form of spot removal is bounce spells, which are cards that return a card to their owner's hand. Any removal, including board wipes, can be called an answer, as in a card that answers a threat. And threats are any card that could potentially kill a player, such as a creature. Creatures are often called beaters, especially larger ones. Cards that deal damage to a player every turn, such as a creature your opponent can't block, is called a clock, usually in the form of a 3-turn clock or a 4-turn clock, meaning that the card will do enough damage to win the game in either 3 or 4 turns. You'll sometimes hear people jokingly refer to 1-power creatures as a 20-turn clock. Evasion is a phrase for any keyword that makes a creature harder to block, such as flying or menace. Going wide is when you play a lot of creatures, whereas going tall is when you play one big creature. If you're going wide, you might try chump blocking, which is blocking a very large creature with a much smaller creature to avoid taking damage. Card advantage is a phrase that means one player having access to more cards than their opponent. Every turn, a player draws one card. If you draw more cards than that, you'll have more cards than you're supposed to, and more cards than your opponent will have. Cards like Divination, for example, give you card advantage because they let you draw more than one card, so it replaces itself and gives you another card. However, there are other ways to get card advantage. Cards like Wrath of God can also give you card advantage if they kill more than one creature. If your opponent uses more than one card to develop their board, and you answer all of them with one card, you just got card advantage because you have access to more cards than they do. On the opposite end of card advantage, we have Tempo. Tempo is basically time in terms of Magic. Every turn, you get to untap all your lands and get to play another. So, the way boards and games develop happen over a series of turns based on the mana system is referred to as tempo. For example, if your opponent plays a creature and you return that creature to their hand, they have to spend more mana to get that creature back out. You're down a card, but you're up tempo because your opponent's mana for casting it the first time is wasted. Together, card advantage and tempo define most games of Magic. Aggro decks are decks built to go as fast as possible, trying to kill their opponent before they can even respond. Aggro decks play lots of cheap threats, and if they're red aggro decks, they'll usually play a ton of direct damage spells, called burn spells by the community. Aggro decks try to win the game through tempo, but lose out on card advantage. While we're on the subject of aggro decks, we should go over the term Stompy. Stompy is the name for any aggro deck that mostly tries to win with creatures, usually green decks where the term originated. Mid-range decks basically just play a bunch of really strong cards. They're the jack-of-all-trades deck style, playing strong threats, removal, and card advantage cards. Mid-range decks try to have game against everything by playing the best individual cards in the format, and playing the cards that line up against other decks the best. Mid-range decks specialize in finding the middle ground between tempo and card advantage. Combo decks are built around very specific interactions, trying to use cards that aren't great on their own and combining them together to make something that's more than the sums of its parts. For example, let's use Storm. Storm is a keyword that lets you copy that card for each other spell that was cast before in this turn. With cards like Tendrils of Agony, which makes your opponent lose 2 life, if you cast 9 other spells on that turn, it will deal 20 damage to your opponent and kill them. So Storm decks will just cast a bunch of spells that don't do anything, and then cast a Tendrils for lethal. Together, these cards can kill your opponent, but separately, they don't do anything. Each combo deck plays a little differently, but fundamentally, they're very similar. Finally, the last deck archetype is Control. Control decks want to use cards like board wipes and card draw spells to win the game through card advantage. These decks are often called Draw-Go decks, named so after the fact that a lot of the time, they'd rather keep their mana up for interactions on their opponent's turn, so they just draw a card, play a land, and pass turn. Now, I want to go in a little more on this deck archetype because other card games call decks Control decks too, but they mean something very different than it does in Magic sometimes. In games like Yu-Gi-Oh!, Control deck refers to a deck that plays cards like Mystic Mine. We won't go too deep into this, but Mystic Mine is a Yu-Gi-Oh! Card that basically makes it so as long as your opponent has a monster, which is what creatures are called in Yu-Gi-Oh!, they can't attack you or activate the effects of monsters. This is a crippling effect, and a lot of decks just can't win if Mystic Mine is on the field. This is very different from what Control decks in Magic do, which are focused on removal, card draw, and board wipes to win the game through card advantage. What Yu-Gi-Oh! Decks call Control decks would be called Prison decks by Magic players. Prison decks play cards like Chalice of the Void, which counters any spell a player casts with a certain mana value based on how many counters are on it, and it gets counters based on how much mana you pay to cast it. And Blood Moon, which makes all non-basic lands mountains instead, which can make decks reliant on non-basic lands unable to cast their spells. This is a bit of a confusion that I've seen when people cross over TCGs before, so to put it simply, what Yu-Gi-Oh! Players call Control decks, Magic players call Prison decks, and Yu-Gi-Oh! Has very few decks that Magic would call Control decks, which is why they don't really have a name for it. While we're talking about Prison decks, we should go over the term Stacks. Stacks is a term both for Prison decks and the individual cards themselves, but we'll go over it a bit more later. Anyway, another term you might hear is the face. This just means your opponent's life total. For example, if you have a lightning bolt and your opponent has a planeswalker, which you could also target, you could say, "I'll bolt your face," to let them know you're targeting them with the bolt and not the planeswalker. A phrase you'll hear in any card game is brick or bricking. Bricks are cards that don't do anything, such as removal spells against a deck that has no cards you can target with it. If you draw a bunch of cards that don't do anything, you're bricking. You'll also hear people use the phrase dead cards in place of bricks, but it means the same thing. Cantrips are the name for cards that cost 1 or 2 mana and draw you a card. Cards like Ponder and Expedite are both cantrips. Another common thing you'll hear is mana flooded or mana screwed. Mana flooding is when you draw too many lands, and mana screwed is when you don't draw enough. Color screw is a form of mana screw where your lands you've drawn don't make the right colors of mana. You'll sometimes hear cards called a 1-drop or a 2-drop. This just refers to the mana value of the card. A 1-mana card is a 1-drop, and a 2-mana card is a 2-drop, and so on and so on. Another thing you'll hear a lot is mana curve. This refers to the distribution of the mana value of cards in your deck. A deck that plays a lot of cheap cards has a low curve, whereas a deck that plays a lot of expensive cards has a high curve. This also leads to the phrase of curve it out, where you basically play a card which has a mana value equal to the amount of mana you have. So a 1-drop on turn 1, a 2-drop on turn 2, etc, etc. ETB is shortening of the card text enter the battlefield, a line of text so often written on cards, players created the shorthand for it. Hate is a card that's very good against a specific deck or strategy. For example, Rest in Peace is Graveyard Hate because it counters graveyard decks. Tapping a land for mana, but not spending that mana yet, is called floating mana. This is usually done in response to cards like Rishadan Port, which taps a land. Alright, that's quite a lot, but we still have a few more terms to go over, specifically cards that have effects named after them. Let's start with Lightning Bolt, a card that deals 3 damage to any target. Anytime something deals 3 damage to something, it's usually called bolting it. Similarly, dealing 2 damage is called shocking after the card called Shock. Dealing 1 damage is called pinging it, as there isn't a well-known card to name them after. There aren't any names for dealing other amounts of damage. Wrath of God is a sorcerer that destroys all creatures, and most creature board wipes will be called Wraths to reference that. Smokestacks is an artifact that costs 4, and your upkeep you can put a suit counter on it. And at the beginning of each upkeep, the player sacrifices a permanent for each suit counter on Smokestacks. This is where Stacks gets its name from. Any card that restricts players' access to resources are called Stacks effects. Grizzly Bears is a very famous 2/2 creature for 2 mana, so all 2/2s for 2 mana are called bears as a reference to them. Threaten is a card that lets you gain control of a creature, untap it, and give it haste, but for only 1 turn. This effect is very common in red and are usually called threaten effects. Diabolic Edict is a card which forces a player to sacrifice a creature, so cards that force players to sacrifice creatures are called edicts. Demonic Tutor is a card that lets you search your library for any card and put it into your hand, so cards that search your deck for cards are called tutors. Vulcan Wrath Aristocrat is a card that lets you sacrifice creatures to give it indestructible for a turn, and that deck plays cards like Blood Artist to make this effect even better. This deck was pretty famous back in Standard, so now decks that want to sacrifice their own creatures a lot are called Aristocrat decks. Glorious Anthem is an enchant that gives all your creatures +1/+1, and cards that give a stab boost to all of your creatures are now called Anthems. Lord of Atlantis is a merfolk that gives all merfolks +1/+1 in Islands Walk, so all creatures that pump creatures of a creature type are called Lords. Momentary Blink is a card that exiles a card and then returns it to the battlefield, and cards with this effect are called Blink effects. Rampant Growth is a card that finds a land from your deck and puts it onto the battlefield. All cards that give you more mana every turn are called ramp effects now, even things like Felware Stone. And finally, Dark Ritual adds 3 black mana to your mana pool for 1 black mana, giving you a short burst of mana on turn 1. Now, any card that adds a shot of mana on 1 turn that goes away after is called a ritual effect. Now let's go over all of the color combination names. All of the 2 color pairs are named after guilds from Ravnica. So if you've ever heard people referring to the guilds, that's likely what they're talking about. Let's start with the allied 2-colored pairs. Allied colors are colors next to each other in the color wheel, and in terms of color pie philosophy, they have a lot in common. If you want to know more about the color pie philosophy, you should check out our video on the subject where I go over it all in more detail. First is white-blue, named Azorius. Blue-black is named Demir. Black-red is named Rakdos, which is also the name of the demon that runs the guild. Red-green is called Gruul, and finally green-white is called Celestia. Continue on to the enemy-colored guilds, we have white-black, called Orzhov. Next is black-green, called Golgari. Green-blue is called Simic. Blue-red is called Izet. And finally, red-white is called Boros. That covers all of the 2-color pairs, so next is the 3-color combinations, all of which have a name. We'll start with the shards, which gets their names from the shards of Alara, where all the names come from. The shards consist of 1 color and both of its ally colors. For example, white's ally colors are green and blue, so together, green, white, blue form a shard. This specific shard is called Bant. Moving on to the others, we have blue and its allies, or white, blue, black, called Esper. Next is black and its allies, blue, black, red, called Grixis. Then there's red and its allies, black, red, green, called Jund. Finally, there's green and its allies, red, green, white, called Naya. Moving away from the shards, we have wedges. These are 3-color combinations named after khans from the Khans of Tarkir, and they consist of 1 color and its 2 enemy colors. For example, white's enemy colors are red and black, so they all form a wedge called Mardu. They're called wedges because if you draw a line between all 3 of them in the color pie, the lines form a wedge. Getting to the other wedges, blue has green and red as enemies, so green, blue, red form a wedge called Temur. Black has white and green as its enemies, so white, black, green forms a wedge called Abzan. Red has white and blue as enemies, so blue, red, white forms a wedge called Jeskai. Finally, green has black and blue as enemies, so black, green, blue forms a wedge called Sultai. Outside of that, there aren't really any other names or other color combinations. 4-color decks are so uncommon that names for them never really stuck. People usually just refer to them as something like whiteless, for a deck with everything but white. Or, if they're playing a deck that's only lightly playing 1 color, they may refer to them with a shard or wedge name with an additional color. For example, back in Standard, Jeskai decks were splashing black to be able to play a card called Kolaghan's Command. These decks are usually called Jeskai Black, to denote that they were mainly a Jeskai deck that was lightly playing black. While we're on this subject, we should mention there's actually a term for this. If you're playing a deck that's mostly one color, but you play another color to play one or two other cards, you're splashing that color, as in this is a red deck with a splash of blue, or something like that. Now, there's a lot more we didn't go over, but we have to call it somewhere. If there are any other common terms that we didn't mention, or if you have ideas for future videos just like this one, let us know down in the comments.